Hello and welcome to Breaking the Cycle. My name is Alan Hyde, and tonight we have a familiar guest with us, and I am excited to have Jessica Seidel, LPC, correct?
Yes, LPC.
Back with us again for round two. How are you doing?
I'm doing good.
Good.
It's been a busy week.
Yeah, and a couple months since we sat down and talked last, right?
Yes, very much so.
Yeah.
So we've had a lot going on.
Yeah, just catching up with you. It sounds like it's been busy mom territory for you.
Very, yes. Having a 7-year-old and an 18-month-old definitely keeps you busy.
Yeah, I bet.
And being the over 35 range, like the energy level is not the same.
Fair enough.
By any means. So we'll see. Being a mom gets to be, it's very rewarding, but it can be very exhausting, I think, at the same time for many people. And I decided to Google. I was all like, mom mental health issues or something like that. And it gives you this like list of issues. And the number one on there is sleep deprivation.
Oh, interesting.
Right? And anyone who's had a kid will tell you like the pregnancy kind of prepares you for it in the fact of like sleep deprivation because you're uncomfortable. I mean, there's the initial like first trimester where you're tired, but then you hit that third trimester where you're big and you're uncomfortable and you can't sleep. And then the baby gets here and you're still not sleeping. And when we look at the brain and the necessity for sleep, it's even more interesting because so our entire body has lymph nodes, which is what cleans out all the dead cells. Those don't exist in our brain. And so I was actually watching a TED Talk. It's been years ago now, and I wish I could remember the name of the gentleman that does it, but they were doing research for Alzheimer's, and they found that the brain has essentially a washout cycle is what it does. So during REM-stated sleep, the cerebral spinal fluid, so the fluid in your spine, comes up into your brain, washes it all out, and clears out the dead cells. And part of the research they were saying is like some of those cells continue to stick to like the myelin sheathing in the brain, which is what affects the connections in Alzheimer's. And so that's kind of the breakthrough research that they found. But understanding that like if you are getting up every 2 to 3 hours with a newborn, how much of that wash cycle isn't happening, I assimilate it to like a straw and a dishwasher. If the dishwasher doesn't get to do its full cycle, the straw still has stuff stuck all to it. Yeah. And so when you're in a continual state like that for months and or years, because my son didn't start sleeping through the night until 17 months out of the current 18 we're in. You're talking that's almost 2 years of sleep deprivation. Like it does funny things to the brain. Yeah.
And for those tracking with us, this was when Jess and I were talking about having her come back on for a round 2 discussion about mental health therapy. This was the topic that Jess had suggested. And tonight we're going to start by talking about motherhood and getting Jessica's opinion on these things. Just from a therapeutic lens, and as we go, if we have time, we may get into fathers and addictions and things like that, and at that point only we'd want the male perspective. So that's kind of the only reason I'm sitting in here tonight. We're going to extract as best we can some details for our female listeners about motherhood and some of the perspectives from a practicing therapist who's kind of worked with women in all different phases of life. And so I think it's really interesting, this point. I had a friend of mine the other day point out this article on Psychology Today called The Mental Load that mothers go through.
Yes.
I'd love to hear your perspective because she was trying to talk to me and I was just hearing her, just listening and being, just as best
the sounding board.
Exactly. Yeah. But I would love to hear your perspective on it because I figured you might have.
Yes. So the mental load is when you have kids and a household, and this is working moms, stay-at-home moms, it doesn't really matter, there's always this kind of constant antenna running in the back of the head is the best way I can kind of describe it. And so when your kids are around you, there's always this like monitoring process going on unconsciously of like listening for sounds, listening for distress, listening for activity, making sure they're not breaking things, And then at the same time, going through the list of like things you have to do for the day or trying to get those things done throughout the day. And so as moms, we're constantly in the mental load we're talking about is that running to-do list in your head of all the things you need to do, the things you need to get, the things you have to have done. And so, you know, for a working mom, I'm default parent, as I call it. You know, I'm the one that has the flexibility in my job that I can pick the kids up on the days off. I can stay home with them when school's out. I can take them to the doctor's appointments, all of that stuff. And so it's kind of the mental load of like, what do you got going on for the week? And so this week, for example, you know, I had my daughter with me on Monday, but then I had a critical meeting on Wednesday. So, you know, it's texting the mother-in-law to be like, okay, I need you to pick her up. And she's like, okay, well, you there on Tuesday? And you're like, yes. And so then Tuesday, which is literally the next day, I get up Tuesday morning, I'm getting the kids ready, and you're like, oh, it's Tuesday. And so then it's like, oh, we've got to get the bags packed because you got to go to Bama's house. And so like making sure we get the bags packed and the lunch boxes going as you're trying to get out the door, and then like what I need to do for work because I've got this going and that going. And then, you know, it's like kids gone and I come to work on Wednesday and I'm like, what do I do? Because like mental load's a little offloaded because there's not the kiddo hanging out in the background and the constant list going. That's can be somewhat exhausting because I think with me and my husband, like we kind of joke in the fact that I'll be all like, it'll be silence, like we'll be reading or playing on our phones or whatever, and I'm like, oh, da-da-da-da-da-da, you know, and I list off like 12 things that need to get done, and he's just kind of like, okay, like where?
Yeah.
He's like, I feel like I stepped in the middle of a conversation, and I was like, yes, it was the conversation going on in my head, and I'm like, oh right, so regarding this, we need to do X, Y, and Z, and that's kind of what I joked about. I was like, that's this ongoing to-do list we constantly have going on top of the antenna when the kids are around, and that's where the mom brain I think comes in with a lot of us, is that you have so much going on inside that it's easy to forget or lose track or seem so distracted by everything around you because it's too much. I mean, we know the brain cannot multitask very well. I mean, they've shown that in research with driving and all of that fun stuff. And so when you've got a mental load going in the background, like you're trying to do a task in front of you and you're all like, wait, did I spread peanut butter on that sandwich? You've got to go back and recheck it.
Yeah, it's astonishing too, even like when they point out in research when you have too much on your mind, there's like with pile-ups on freeways, how often the person wasn't texting and driving, they just were having those momentary lapses. And again, you know, you're not going to read too much of that in a police report as to like why that's happening, but a lot of it is stuff like this. And it's, I guess the manifestation would be a slightly different thing for a dude, but it's still the mental load, which brings me to the humorous question, or at least like the helpful question that we know maybe some men would take the feedback, some wouldn't, but what does a mother need from a partner? And this is good for me as well as a dude, for, you know, my future partner, of like, right. what does the mother need from their male partner, assuming they're in a heterosexual relationship, to help ease that load? But yeah, any partner.
So it's going to be, one, seeing it as a partnership. I mean, we're very much in a society where we have defaulted that mom takes care of the kids. That is obviously changing with like your millennial generation, your Gen Z. Like we've seen this progression change. And so more dads are involved, but it's at the different levels and different capacities. And it's a lot of, I think, for women, communicating what you need, because we often can feel like we're burdening the other parent with what we need, because we feel like we have to take it all on. And so for gentlemen or for the partner, I think it's important to, one, ask, hey, how can I help you? Because if you ask what we need, I don't know that we're gonna be able to answer you in that moment, because we don't see it as a need per se, but being aware of what you see your significant other doing, and helping in those situations. Because for like my husband and myself, we both are very, can get overstimulated with the kids and all the noise and stuff like that. And so it's recognizing that overstimulation in each other to step in and help out. And it's the helping out without having to ask for it. I see a lot of that kind of like show up on TikTok. Like, I shouldn't have to ask for help. You should know what needs to be done. But at the same time, if y'all haven't had those discussions, you're kind of expecting this telepathic expectation from your partner. And so, having time when that downtime, having the pillow talk, whatever you want to call it, of, hey, when X, Y, and Z happens, what would be most helpful for me is this.
Yeah. And I think too, like, speaking to the males who might be listening to this is, don't take it personal. No. Abandon expectations in that. That's your partner just letting you in on the world of how she's feeling in that moment. This is something that took me time. I was like a bull in a china shop with emotions when I was a young man, and years of working on that in therapy, and just creating space. And here's a big, I was talking with a buddy of mine about this, is like, I've found the more like patient I've been with my emotions and other people's emotions, the less opinionated I am. Like, I can't afford to have an opinion if I want to connect with people. And there's boundaries in that as well, because, not everybody's going to believe what we believe and all that good stuff. But, I'm finding more and more, if you want a peaceful life, they don't have to.
Exactly. And knowing with your partner, it's never about fixing the problem they come to you with. Sometimes it's just, like you talked about, it's that mental load. You have so much going on in your head. You kind of need to offload it. And the best way to offload it, as we know as therapists, is talking about it. Yeah. And so sometimes they just want to vent to you. And I've seen several talks, but like in a relationship, the best thing to do is when you're in a conversation with your partner and you realize, like, I don't know what you're wanting me to do in this situation. Ask. You preface it. So it's like, I'm going to stop you for a second. Are you looking for a solution, an ear, or sympathy? Like, which of these are you looking for? So I know what I need to do essentially in this conversation. Let's
highlight that and state it again too, because especially I know men, and I know that the men, at least the ones I know personally who watch this, is we need to hear these things. And I remember how important it was for me, because I would ask, like, my therapist would be like, well, what do I ask? So if we could state that again.
Yes. So you're going to ask, are you looking for me to fix it? Are you looking for a solution? Are you looking for an ear, or are you looking for sympathy? So are you looking for me to give you ideas of how to fix it? Are you just wanting me to listen because you're venting? Or are you really seeking some type of sympathy? Like, do I need to be as outraged about this as you are right now? And so it always makes me think about, for anybody who watches Big Bang Theory out there, the scene between Sheldon and Amy, and they're having dinner, and Amy asks for the butter, and Sheldon is going on and on and on about this PS4 dilemma and trying to figure out which one to get. And he ignores her request for the butter. And so she changes tactics, and she gets very empathetic with him, because it seems like maybe that's what it is. And so he's talking about these things. She's like, no way, totally. And the scene ends with him being all like, it's something along the lines of like, oh, what should I do? And she goes, pass me the butter. And so it's one of those moments, like, maybe if they'd communicated before, like, what he was looking for in that conversation, she could have empathized better and then gotten to the point where she could have asked for the butter, and she wouldn't have had to do it that way.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, it's interesting too, because, I resonate with this, like, the beginning half of that before it's passed me the butter again, which is like, I know a lot of men that I work with too, that we don't feel heard very often, which is interesting in a culture that is like, when we were growing up, was all men. Okay. And at least the culture I grew up in, where I grew up on a baseball field, it's all about us, and departing from that, it's like learning to be heard is really like, you got to be quiet first, And it's so interesting, like the empathizing part. It's like men, when women are empathizing with you, it's because they want to be heard too, and that was a lesson for me as well. It's like, oh, that's right, that's intimacy, getting to know someone, right, hearing them so that you can be heard, and other times they're going to hear you so that they can be heard. And I think a lot of times there's some real like simple solutions in that get pushed right under the rug until the rug has this huge lump in the middle.
And then somebody steps on it and they all explode out from under the rug, right?
Yeah.
And then you're sweeping up the mess behind it. Right. I ran across a quote somewhere. I've heard it before, and I'm sure many of you have, but as a reminder, like, when you're in a conversation, you've got to listen to understand, not listen to respond. Yeah. And so when I'm working with parents who are struggling, because I'm going to tell you right now, for couples out there, if you have a spouse that is expecting or has just had a baby and you feel like they hate you all the time, they do. Don't take it personal though. Like, it's just the fact you have to realize as a mom, we have gone from being this strong, independent female, right? Doing our own thing, doing what we need to do, to having a human being who is literally depending on us for their mere survival of life.
Yeah.
And so we've gone from doing whatever we want to do to having somebody with us all the time. And it's exhausting to have to do that. And so this kind of undertone of resentment develops of getting to watch your partner, like, not have a baby clinging to you all the time, especially if you're a breastfeeding mom, right? Like, the kid's on you all the time. And so it can build some animosity in the fact that seeing your partner get to sleep in or get to do this or get to do that. And what I tell you is, don't let the animosity build. Let them know where you're struggling with it. If you are planning to have kids, have those discussions. Like, how are you going to break up the nighttime feedings? How are you going to break up the parenting in general? How are you going to help each other get a break from whatever's going on? My husband and I have been together since I was 19. And so we've kind of figured it out along the way. My education and counseling and stuff like that, I think, has helped us. Yeah. But by no means are we perfect. We still have to figure stuff out. We're still figuring out how to communicate with each other and not piss each other off when we do so, all of those kinds of things. And so being mindful of these things when you're becoming a parent or you are parenting.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the beauty of why it's helpful in some of these situations, being a clinician, is like how easy it is to take all that kind of stuff that you were just, educating on personally, you know. And God, I just remember being a young clinician and, reverting from like everything's personal to literally nothing's personal, and having those moments still of like, oh, that's right, this isn't personal, and being able to communicate through that. I thought that was really brilliant, just for any relationship out there, even with friendships, is like, have you had the discussion? Have you guys asked each other how you feel and what you didn't like about that situation? And, because if not, then how are you going to hold a boundary?
Exactly.
For yourself.
And how are they going to change?
Right. Yeah.
Because, part of being a therapist, right, is we believe everybody has the ability to change.
Yeah.
And so helping others figure out how to communicate the need for change in those situations.
That, and I know you'll have a similar perspective on this, because the more you and I are getting to know each other, I just know we're on similar wavelengths in the way that we have grace for people. There's also this thing my therapist used to tell me of like, don't get so caught up in the time frames in which you want to see the change in people, because although there is that grace for those who aren't sociopathic to change, right, which is such a small percentage of the human population, some take a really long time, and it may feel like they're never going to change, and that can be hurtful too when it's like someone you love and you realize like, not only is that going to take a really long time to change, but by the time they do, it's like, should I have left, should I have stayed? That brings us into conversations we were briefly touching on before of like, do we want to talk about divorce and those kind of things? And it's tricky. It's really tricky.
Yeah. I can say, parenting is the biggest challenge I think most relationships will ever face, outside of like a financial, large financial situation, right?
Yeah.
Because when we are put into this parenting place, I like I said to you earlier, like we parent as we were parented until we know better. And oftentimes we may not like that person we become when we're parenting, because of whatever the dynamic was as a child. Or you may not like the parent your partner becomes because of some of that dynamic.
Yeah.
You know, when we've dealt with a difficult childhood, and don't have a relationship with our parents, or the relationship with our parents is very strained, and then see a mimic of it in our partners, it's really hard to cope with. And oftentimes I would say we get triggered and react rather than reflect and respond. And instead of having the conversation of, hey, I noticed you did this and this, and it bothered me because X, Y, and Z, what I would like to see in the future is, right? Always being open about those conversations. I think Brene Brown does a really great job of kind of talking about how to have those hard conversations so that you're not blaming and shaming in those situations.
Well, right as you were saying it, I was thinking of her breakdown on boundaries of like vulnerable requests. And
Yes.
Yeah. You know, I find that I'm curious if you do too in your clinical practice of like getting a client not only to realize like where the lines are for boundaries of like you can't place them on someone else, but then when we get to the point of vulnerable requests, people squirm.
They do.
They get real squirmy.
Yes. I've got a client right now that it was about setting boundaries with her sister, who is an addict, and not being fearful of doing so for the fear of losing the relationship.
Yeah.
And having to have that conversation of, but is this a healthy relationship to have? And ultimately, I mean, when she did finally choose to set the boundary, what her biggest fear happened. Yeah. And so then it's processing that. And, you know, as a parent, sometimes that's setting those boundaries with your parents, or grandparents. And it could be very difficult because it might mean not having a relationship anymore. Yeah. And it's such an interesting conversation to have with people because of societal expectations, societal norms, or cultural things that people deal with, and the respect we're supposed to give parents or grandparents. And it can be hard to set those boundaries, but you also have to realize, like, you're not just doing this for you, you're doing it for your children and showing them what that healthy relationship can look like and what those communication skills can look like. Yeah. And yeah, it was like, it becomes a very, very hard place.
Yeah. Yeah. What keeping the bridge intact looks like, but the door isn't open right now.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. But it has hinges. Yes. You know, we can open the door if they come back correctly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the hinges usually go both ways.
Yeah. 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 For ease of access on both sides. And we get to control that, you know, versus trying to control all the things that we can't. That's the beauty, I think, of boundaries. You know, what I found for a guy like me is like I had control issues when I was younger of like I came from an alcoholic home, and that was the way it afflicted me, is trying to control everybody. And being able to step into a place of boundaries of like there are some things I get to control. It's just a very, very short list.
Yes.
But that's the good news, is that it's not all these other things that lead to a mental load in my own way, you know?
Yes. And I love that you talk about that, because, I mean, there are two leading emotions in parenthood that cause the biggest problem, and it's depression and anxiety, right? And anxiety often comes from that wanting to control and not being able to. And so when you can focus on the few things you have the ability to control as a parent and learn to let go of the other things, you can often find that you can find that joy in parenting again. And it doesn't feel like a task or an obligation, or this, burden that sometimes honestly, it can feel like.
Sure.
When you're raising other human beings, you could have, we struggled with fertility issues. And so like, you can want those kids with all of your heart and still not like them some days.
Yeah.
Just gonna be honest.
Yeah.
And it's in those moments of depression, anxiety, that depending on the support system of the parent, that we start to see other unhealthy coping mechanisms start to develop. Right. And I remember, and you can kind of probably talk about this more, but I remember there being in the news where it was talking about moms taking Adderall. Like when Adderall kind of first came out to be how it was this great drug, and we were finding that, people were misusing it because it gave them energy and this, that, and the other. And being a mom, like I can totally see and imagine the moments these moms had where you are trying to take care of the kids, potentially work another job. You've got to keep the house clean, the dishes done, the floor swept, mopped. You got to do the grocery shopping. You've got to cook dinner. You've got to plan the doctor's appointment and maybe the family vacation or the upcoming date night or whatever the case might be going. But you're also sleep deprived. You've only had 3 hours of sleep for the last 3 days, and you're trying to get it all done because perfection, right?
Right.
Societal perfection, not the actual perfection that happens. And it's very easy to slip into the I think I've got ADHD because I'm not sleeping enough. I'm distracted. It's hard to focus. And doctor prescribes Adderall, and you realize, oh, it's working so well. If I take more makes it better, right? And then that's a slippery slope.
Yeah, yeah. We had a few jokes, completely insensitive, but back in the day when I was working at the Salvation Army, way back when I was just so green. I started in the field really young. But we would always joke about we better check for Pez dispensers, because, we got the pill poppers, or the pill prescription writers who are keeping Pez in business because you'll empty out the candy and just put the pills in there so you can pop them. And, but it still is a real problem, but it was a real problem there for, I would say, a good 10 to 15 years, where, the common conception is that you go out and it's in every mom's purse, and that's not true, but the percentage was high enough, and it's alarming. I think in our culture, in American culture, how pervasive addiction is, but how easy it is to shirk off that part of the conversation. Oh
yeah. I mean, denial is kind of the big thing with it, right? Yeah. I don't have a problem. Things are going well. If I'm functioning and everything's getting done, so I don't have a problem. Yeah. And I don't think that's the hallmark sign that there's not a problem, right. To begin with. And a lot of that is put on us by society. I think the biggest struggle I have as a mom sometimes, I'll talk about it. So Instagram and TikTok are the worst places, and Facebook, right? To go and see other people, because you are catching literally milliseconds of a point in time that oftentimes can be fabricated. It's not hard. We've seen the joke TikToks about how you do that. Yeah. And the dangerous part is when we start comparing ourselves to those individuals as a parent. One of the things I got caught up in this last year, I've now got 2 kids, which is a very different dynamic than having 1 kid. I think I ran into something that talked about 1 kid is equal to 2 kids, 3 kids is equal to 5 kids, and 5 kids is equal to the equivalent of a zoo. It's a lot you have going on. Yeah. And my first kiddo was a girl. She was super chill. Didn't really get into stuff. Kind of did her own thing. It was no big deal. Even though I thought she was the difficult kid, but we can get into that later. How I'd convinced myself. But having a boy the second time around. Boys are different. Yeah. And I say that even having 4 brothers, I'm they're just a different breed. He's in everything. He didn't sleep through the night. It's just this constant thing. And, I grew up in a household where the house is expected to be clean, and you make the bed and you get everything put together and da-da-da. And I'm seeing my friends and going and visiting my friends, and they've got kids and their house is clean. And I'm what am I doing wrong here? And it wasn't until I had a conversation with them, she's oh no, I've got a cleaning person. I'm bloody hell. Yeah. oh, you have a secret weapon nobody's talked about. That's a different story. It's like, I don't have a cleaning lady. I'm trying to do it all myself. Yeah. And so keeping in perspective, like that person you idolize or envy or wish you could be, dig a little deeper. There's probably more support there than what you're aware of.
Yeah.
And think about that. Yeah.
I think that's a really good universal point too. Man, woman, child. It's okay to ask for help. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember certain circles of communities when I started to take better care of myself, and I would hear people say like, my house is clean enough, you know, or like it's tidy enough. And I'd be like, man, I'm used to like, I'll put on like knee pads and scrub the baseboards, and it's like, no one's coming over. No. I live alone. It's tidy enough. Yes. You know, like I'm having a bunch of friends over tomorrow. We do like a board game night that we split once a month. That's and, nice. You know, my dog makes my house messy. Mm-hmm. You know, I love him to death, but I'm just living in his house, you know.
I know the feeling.
And, you know, there was a split moment where I was like, man, I got to make sure this place is spotless. And I realized like, they all have pets. They all have kids. No one's going to care if there's some dog hair here. It's just is what it is. It's tidy enough. Yes. As long as it's not in the food.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. I think there was a social media post, and it was like, what moms expect when guests come over, and it's this guest like running in the door and going to check if like the bed's made and dusting with their white glove and da 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 da. Like, and it is like, that is, I think internally what all moms do when guests come over is like, you want it to be perfect, and it's never going to be.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna say sooner you can kind of come to terms with that or make peace with that, I think you'll find peace within yourself too, and not struggle with it as much.
Yeah, you know, and it's interesting, and maybe this is just a side note, but as I'm listening to that and I'm thinking, it's like, you know, whenever I've gotten those lessons in my life, I think because of the consequence of the work that we do and the recovery support and all that kind of stuff, it's like when I hear a lesson that's good feedback and I'm ready to internalize it, I'll embrace it. And then also on the flip side, letting go of like how much someone else is going to embrace it. Because, you know, see that with the version of clients I work with, because, you know, our higher power or whatever sends us clients that are a lot like us. And the reflection I get is helping clients like just be okay with the level in which an individual in your life is willing to implement certain things at work. And, you know, unless it's egregious stuff where the answer to the question is like, I can't stick around if this never changes. But if your answer is like, I would never leave this person in a million years, then stop trying to get them to do it perfectly.
Right.
You know?
Yes. Yeah. Have you had a chance to see the new Inside Out 2?
I have not.
Okay.
I plan to.
It does a really great job of depicting anxiety, but how perfection leads to anxiety. Yeah. And oftentimes I know the clients I work with, like if you really dig down deep, there's a perfectionistic core belief that's driving some of what you're struggling with when it comes to that anxiety. And it might be the Instagram moms that you're seeing, or it's the mom in your head. And it may have been your mom or your grandma. Or this ideal belief you have that's just not realistic. And so it's reevaluating what that belief system is a lot of times.
Yeah. Well, and I like that you point out that all these things have a generational quality to it. And obviously, you know, we talk about that kind of stuff here, but it's even aside from all the natural ways it intersects with the channel and a lot of the conversations we have, perfectionism has its root so much in things like addiction. It has its root so much in learned behaviors that are carried from generation to generation, resentments that go unresolved, that like, why is mom so angry at me? Well, she's actually not angry at you. She's angry at her mom, and now you're her greatest mirror, so she sees that she kind of looks like her mom and her behaviors. You know, and the same is true for men. This is like,
100%.
We could just interject man, woman there, and it's just like, it gets perpetuated.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and I'm glad that you brought that up. I think one of the revelations I had with my husband when we decided to have kids is he made the comment, I don't know how to be a dad. And it was like, what? Well, of course you don't. Like, we've never been, And he's like, but the example I've had, right? And I told him, and I was like, you're not alone in that. Like, I struggle with that too. My mom was an alcoholic. She wasn't really present. And wanting to be the parent you needed, not the parent you had. And understanding how to be able to do that with your kiddos when you haven't learned how. Yeah. I was lucky enough, right? Like, by the time I became a parent, I'd gone through being a therapist. I'd, therapy training. I had been a parent educator for so many years. By the time our daughter arrived, my husband didn't have that. Like, he's in a very different field than I am. And so, trying to help kind of coach him along that, like, it's going to be okay. Like, you will figure that out and what that looks like. And, we do often talk about women and what our struggles are, but forgetting that dads often have the same or very similar struggles.
Emotionally, right?
Yes.
The thread.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because, like I said, like, we all know there's not a handbook. I mean, it'd be great. Maybe I'll create one day. I don't know.
You should, and then we'll market it everywhere.
But I mean, it's you can't, because you're raising humans, and humans are, if anything, unpredictable and unique in how they see the world and perceive things and think. And so, for those that are struggling out there with trying to be the perfect parent, all you need to be is the parent you needed as a kid.
Yeah. And I have a couple dudes who are stepping into fatherhood that I've worked with for years, and the only reason I know to do this one is because I had done it with my therapist, and it's grieving the loss of the idea of the parents you wanted. That they had their limitations. It's okay that it wasn't without love, but that there were some things that happened that were less than desirable. But also, it's okay to grieve that they weren't what you wanted them to be.
Yes.
And sometimes I could get choked up thinking about it, because like sometimes it's like those people are gone.
Yeah, so you can't get
there's not a whole lot of closure with the person. Or it's just so active. That was my experience. It was just still so active, that grieving that was just like, but it improved the relationships to a point of like what it could be, not what I wanted it to be, what it could be. Yeah.
Well, and knowing that, like, I think a lot of times the clients I work with, what I recognize is like, you cannot like how your parents raised you and still love your parents.
Yeah.
It's okay. Like, you can have both.
Yeah.
And know that, in most cases, parents want the best for their children. They just don't always know what that is or how to give that.
Right.
And they parented the best that they could with what they knew. In most cases, obviously there's those outliers, but, if you can understand that first, I think that helps with some of the resentment that builds up, that puts that wall there that keeps that relationship, from healing.
Yeah. And when you were giving the example briefly, and I don't know anything more than this of what you shared about your husband, other than he's got to be a good guy, just as I've gotten to know you, is, the kind of men who are willing to ask that question. I always try to remind those guys in my clinical practice, like, brother, the fact that you're willing to ask that question says everything you'll ever need to know about whether or not you'll be a good dad.
Exactly.
Because if you could just ask every so often, more often than not even every time, just more often than not, your kids are going to grow and really appreciate what you did as a dad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cause I mean, the kids recognize effort. Like, kids aren't even looking for perfection. They just need a parent that loves them.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I'm trained in nurturing parenting. And there's a part of the curriculum that, you have the class fill out, and you ask them, what is your best memory of your parents? And so you have them fill this out. You give time for them to kind of fill it out. And every single time, it is the time they spent with the parent.
Yeah.
It is never the large Disney vacation. It's never the really cool toy that they bought me. It's never the perfect outfits that I had. It was that I got to hang out, you know, like me and mom would get up early in the mornings and have coffee and da-da-da. Or me and dad always went to go da-da-da-da. It is the time they spend with you, not even what you do.
Yeah. I would say that that's universal for like every type of relationship. You know, I got into all kinds of shenanigans with my friends, but what I remember about them is that we would just spend time together.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there would be times where we would just sit and do nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And like you were saying, it's just when we're called upon to talk about our parents in those ways, it's uncanny, you know, especially when it comes to like safe, vulnerable spaces where we're going to process. Those are the truth moments of our intimacy with people, of like, what's the one thing I wish I could have back kind of stuff, you know?
Yeah. And for those out there that like, you know, because I have had classes where it's like, well, I never really spent time with my parents. And I was like, okay, well, what do you wish y'all did? What would that look like if you could do it with them now? To get them into that space. And I encourage, you know, for those of you out there who maybe didn't have a great relationship with your parents or it was distant, you know, what do you wish that had looked like? And then if you have kids now or when you have kids, that's what you do.
Yeah. And these classes that you're doing, do you offer them virtually? Do you do them in person? Do you do both?
Both.
Okay.
And so it's just kind of depends on what the person's looking for. In person, I don't know. Virtual's been really hard because in person, I feel it's a lot of times the parenting classes. It's a connection, and so being able to see the individual you're talking to, but also I feel like in person offers a better chance to ask questions. Because I often find when you're talking in general topics about parenting, you get deeper topics underneath that when the questions come in.
Yeah.
And so I think back to a class I taught that I had a mom that was struggling with getting her daughter to hold her hand across the street. And she was like, it's always this fight. And I was like, okay. And I was like, I understand that for kids, they're just they just follow you along wherever you're going and then hope that they don't step in the pothole along the way. Like that's what kids are doing. So they don't feel like they're in control. So how can we give her a little control in that moment to help her get across the street with you? And we kind of talked about, you know, helping her kind of feel comfortable with she's like, well, she has to hold my hand to get across the street. I was like, understood. But do you have to walk across the street? Can you skip across the street? Can you hop across the street? What ways can you give her power? Like you're still setting the boundary of like what those are, but like, can you do that? And I actually had the privilege of teaching a second class with them and finding out, she's like, so I got to try what you talked about and it worked. And I'm like, isn't that cool?
Yeah.
But helping her kind of process this, the struggle was like being able to be comfortable giving the child control.
Yeah. Sufficient challenge, right? As the child grows, it's as hard as it is, it's okay at a certain point when they want to cross the road without holding your hand. And if they're at the age where that's a sufficient challenge and it makes sense, you know, if they're 3 years old, you know,
obviously,
different story. But yeah, so I've always liked that component and it ties right into everything you were just saying, to the point where it's probably part of what you teach is sufficient challenge for the age range they're at. And if you can give them that autonomy, it will grow exponentially.
Yes. And it's, you know, I ran across something. Are you familiar with Bluey?
Yeah.
Okay.
Roughly.
Have you watched Bluey? Okay. So I might be on like round 4 of all 3 seasons. Because we watch this every morning with the kiddos. And I joke and I was like, this isn't a kid show. It's a parenting show that kids like to watch. But there was a TikTok, Instagram, something I ran across, and it was talking about how they were asking somebody about Bluey, and he had said like, oh, it's such a disrespectful show. And he's like, well, what do you find disrespectful about it? And it was essentially the way that, kids are kind of allowed to have a voice, allowed to challenge the parent, allowed to do these things. And so understanding that, like, that is his core parenting from growing up and what he experienced as a kid. And so that's what respect is. Right?
Interesting, huh?
And how that kind of authoritarian, right, parenting style can be really stressful when you're trying to get the 5-year-old to do exactly as you want them to.
Yeah.
When we know 5-year-olds, they don't like to sit still, much less do exactly what you want them to.
Yeah.
And so, but it was just kind of an interesting perspective of, what each person kind of sees in what good parenting is, or what is considered respectful behavior by children.
Yeah. Yeah, or just because other people are doing it differently in today's culture, which is like, look, people were doing it those ways back then too. It just wasn't on television.
Right.
Or it wasn't on social media. This has always existed because when we start to step into support, this is how healthy adults are interacting with each other and how healthy adults are parenting their children. It's just there's a popular cultural idea of like, you've got to sit them down and tell them what to do. And it's like, look, I don't know if that works the best. What I do know is that once you're all adults and you're seeking support, that really doesn't work. You come into my practice and I tell you, sit down and here's what you're going to, it's like you would find another therapist at a certain point, because it would be uncomfortable because it reminds you of mommy and daddy.
Pretty much, yes.
Yeah.
And, sometimes what triggers you the most is, things that mom and dad did, that you weren't a fan of when you were younger.
Right. Where could, just in interest of time as well, where could people find your information if they wanted to sign up for a said class to get this benefit?
So you can go to my website and find my information there. But I'd say right now it's primarily like calling to request information. I don't know that I have an information sheet on there yet. But if you want to see like other information I have about parenting, what it's like to be a parent, things about parenting, you can check me out on Instagram and TikTok at TherapyMomTX.
Yeah. And Jessica's information is posted and tagged in all the things that we're posting. If you liked what Jessica had to say today and you missed our first episode together, that is on YouTube at Breaking the Cycle Podcast. It's also on Spotify at the same handle. It was a wonderful conversation we had about children and just kind of like that phase of life. And this conversation has been about parents. Mm-hmm. I do have one more question for you, just in the light of talking about families and such. What is one board game that you think is a perfect metaphor for therapy?
Ooh, for therapy.
Yeah.
Gosh. Metaphor for therapy. Trouble.
Why trouble?
It's one of those. So for those of you who haven't played Trouble before, you have to move spaces and then get to your home plate. And sometimes what that means is that somebody might step on you and you have to go back, and you have to try again. And oftentimes, in therapy, you kind of feel like you're making progress. And then, oh, wait, there's a trigger you didn't realize you had. And so we've got to go back and we've got to kind of try again. So that we can get all your little men home. And that's how you kind of, it's learning that it's not perfect, right?
Yeah.
You're not going to get it the first time around. You may have to try 2 and 3, 4 times, get all your people out on the board before you can get them around the board to get them to where they need to be.
I like that. Couples therapy would be sorry.
That's fair. Mm-hmm.
Any last words you would share with the listeners?
Just knowing that, I think I joked with you earlier, like at one point somebody had called me a parenting expert when I did parenting education, and nobody's an expert in parenting. I felt like I was trained and ready to go, and I still stumbled and fumbled along the way. I still had high anxiety. I still dealt with that like baby blues that comes with it. And I did better with my second, but again, he's literally the complete opposite of my daughter. And so it was like being a new parent all over again. And so having grace and mercy with yourself as a parent, you know, mom or dad, or partner, whatever that may look like for you. And just anytime you're struggling with it, think about what you would need in that moment, or that you would want somebody to do for you when you weren't doing well. Because I mean, my son's 18 months. We are in the middle of like tantrums and emotions and independence, and having to remember like, what would I need right now if I was struggling with being tired or overstimulated and things like that.
Yeah. Taking care of you.
Yes. So.
Well, Jessica, thank you so much for coming back on, and we're going to have you on many more times in the future, but I'm just very grateful for you.
Awesome. Thank you, Alan, so much. This is a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Ladies and gentlemen, Jessica Seidel. Huge shout out to Chance, our producer. He's the one who makes all of this look so beautiful. And we will see you next Friday, 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. We break the cycle together. We love you.